So we've heard so far about the stress response and how it gets started, and we've talked a little bit about what happens when it gets stuck. And we've seen how the stress response can be activated when we encounter burnout, and there are just too few resources, too little time. We've seen how the stress response can get activated in caring for others through compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress, where bearing witness to other people's pain and grief can cause us to have stress reactions in response. And then we've heard too how our own experiences of trauma kick off that stress response, and we need ways to complete that stress cycle so that we can move back into that middle of the window of tolerance where we're calm and engaged and able to be, that non-anxious presence for our ministry settings wherever we serve. And so that brings us to this third session that we've titled Stewardship of Self. So we talked about at the very beginning how stress is a part of being human. It's a part of how we are made, even in the image of God. And so finding ways and practicing ways to complete the stress cycle is good, not just self-care, but good stewardship of the bodies and the minds and the ministry that we've been given. And so we invite you in this session to hear some practical ways to help complete that stress cycle, maybe to find some practices that make sense for you in order to care for yourself and be a good steward of the body and mind that God has given you.
So now we're going to take a moment and talk a little bit about the flow of what's needed when we complete the stress cycle. And just like Jay mentioned, we've talked about how that happens, how we can get stuck. And so here we're going to talk about a couple things to keep in mind when we're talking about completing the stress cycle specifically. The first thing we want to talk about is identifying that we're in that stress cycle. And in order to do that, we need to know what it is. So since we've already set you up for that, now you might have an opportunity to identify in your own responses to different things that happen throughout the day or throughout the week. Oh, okay. I'm in my stress cycle now. All right, so acknowledging that and noticing it without judgment. And this can be really challenging if we really pride ourselves on just kind of being stoic and able to take whatever comes our way. But the reality is that acknowledging that we're in the stress cycle will help us prepare ourselves for what we need to do to complete that. So being able to notice that we're in that, acknowledge that that process is happening, and that, like Jay said, it is a normal process for us to be in. It's what our bodies are intended to do in response to stress. And then here, the response component is what we're talking about when we say complete the stress cycle. We're going to talk just in a minute about a couple really practical strategies for doing that. But in order to get to the point of responding and completing that stress cycle, we need to be able to identify and acknowledge that we're in it. And I like a phrase that from the work of Dan Siegel called name it to tame it. And it's this idea that if we can take what's internal, what feels silent and secret, or what seems subconscious, and we can consciously name that that's happening, that takes a little bit of the wind out of the sails, and then we can move forward into the response. And then a lot of the time as we're learning more about things like the stress cycle, we might feel frustrated that in the moment we can't do all of these things like we would like to, but then in hindsight, we can say, oh, okay, that's what was happening. And that's an opportunity for self-compassion. This idea that we can acknowledge that the way that we were throughout the day, the exhaustion that we experienced, the way we felt a little off throughout an experience earlier in the day, that was part of a process, and we can offer that self-compassion to ourselves without judgment. And then curiosity, the idea that we can think about, okay, let me think a little bit more about that experience. I wonder what if, complete the sentence, or maybe next time, complete the sentence. And think about ways that you can be more aware, more self-compassionate, that you can identify more in the moment what's happening, and then offer yourself the opportunity to reflect back and then forward on what might happen next time and what strategies are needed to complete the stress cycle.
Yeah, I don't know your Dr. Siegel, but I do know Mr. Rogers, who said, basically, if it's mentionable, it's manageable.
Yeah.
And so really what he said was anything that's part of the human experience is worth talking about and worth naming, because it is a part of the human experience, and then we have a chance to be able to deal with it. So I think that connects to the name and tame.
Very much so. One of the things that I like to mention when we think about strategies for completing the stress cycle is that if we reflect on the idea that the stress cycle is a neurobiological response, then the body needs to be a part of the response. We can't simply think through it. So it would be nice if we could sort of positively think ourselves out of the stress cycle, but primarily the stress cycle isn't cognitive. It's not just part of a thinking process. So when we consider the stress cycle and what we need to complete it, we're going to start off talking about some body-based strategies, because the body needs to feel safe before the brain can think safely. What happens in the body tends to be subconscious and instinctual, whereas when we think about the brain and strategy and planning and logic, a lot of that process is happening at a slower rate than what's happening internally, physiologically for us. So let's talk about a couple body-based strategies. The first one, breathing exercises. Breathing exercises can very much be a part of helping to regulate the nervous system. It's helping everything slow down just for a minute. It would be really easy to find some deep breathing exercises online if you took a minute to do that, but we can do box breathing, where you're inhaling, holding, exhaling, and then resting for the same amount of time all the way around, or you can vary those seconds that you're doing that a little bit differently. Physical exertion, doing exercise, running, even crying, laughing, and not just the polite laugh that we all give when someone at church tells us a joke that we don't really think is funny, but that sort of like guttural laugh that happens when, it's just instinctually loud. Like think of a guffaw or something that really comes out that can complete that for us. Yoga is something that can also help from a body-based strategy standpoint. It incorporates a lot of deep breathing, and it can also regulate your heart rate in the process. Another body-based strategy we can think about is to use someone else that's safe for you to do what we call co-regulation. So using their presence to help signal to your own nervous system that you're safe. One way you can do that is if you feel comfortable and they're a safe person for you, have them give you a big bear hug and hold that for a solid minute. And in that process, your breathing rate and your heart rate can begin to match theirs. And that can be what we call co-regulating. If you don't have a person that you feel safe with, sometimes maybe even an animal, a dog on your lap, might be a way of co-regulating as well. Anything that allows your own nervous system, your own breath rate and heart rate to match with another's that is more calm, that is a way that you can complete the stress cycle. Sleep, also a very body-based strategy, can help complete the stress cycle. And some of you might be able to name a time when you could tell that you were feeling highly anxious, but then you were able to take a nap, or after a night's sleep, you felt different about the experience that you had the previous day. So those are just a couple examples of some body-based strategies that we can use so that the body can feel safe, so that the brain can think safely.
So it would be great if all of our stress responses were activated in times when we were alone or had plenty of space and time to be able to engage the practices to help complete the stress cycle. We know that's usually not the case.
Right.
And so it's helpful to think about some ways to manage the reactivity in the moment in order to slow the stress response down or complete the stress cycle in small ways throughout the day rather than it building up and building up and building up. So we think about that as managing reactivity. And I know that as a minister, we may find ourselves both culturally conditioned or constrained by the expectations of the ministry role to have a fairly limited range of reaction to things that we experience as stressful or traumatic. An angry church member just haranguing you, you may not be able to run, even though your brain is trying to get you to flee. You may not, and probably shouldn't, punch them in the nose, even though your brain is sending signals to fight, and you feel anger rising in you. Or, I can think of times when, sitting with someone in deep grief, also feeling, beginning to take on their grief and feeling my own stress, growing more uncomfortable, and just the desire to get out of that room as fast as possible, right? And so identifying that a stress response is starting and being able to kind of intersect with some activity to manage that reactivity can help lessen the impact overall, right, toward compassion fatigue or even our own trauma in the long run. If we can do some things in the midst of it to kind of turn it down a little bit, keep it from getting stuck in a really hard place. And so when you feel that stress response kicking in, to greet it with some compassion. I'm feeling angry. My anger is growing. I want to fight or flee. To greet that with, that self-compassion of, okay, I'm experiencing something hard, and my body and brain are behaving like they were made to do to keep me safe. And to maybe even greet that with gratitude, even though that's really challenging and difficult in the moment. But then also to greet it with curiosity. I wonder why I am reacting like I do, to hear this story or in this moment. The combination of self-compassion and curiosity are kind of the gateway to other responses, because they help bring you into a presence, bring you back into the present, right? Instead of, in that sort of activated state. And then you can do some practices once you're aware of kind of what's going on to help turn down the immediacy of the stress response. So these would be grounding exercises. If you Google grounding exercises, you'll get plenty of them. A couple that have worked for me and that you can do in the presence of others, even people who are causing your stress to go up. Taking a sip of water and just holding it in your mouth or swishing it around your mouth can be a way of bringing you back into the present and turning down the temperature of the stress response a little bit. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where you look for 5 things you can see, or 4 things you can hear, or 3 things you can touch, or just bringing yourself into the physical space where you are can help your brain recognize that you're safe in this moment. And then you can practice some vagus nerve exercises. So the vagus nerve is the pathway that our stress response travels in our body. Resmaa Menakem, who we quoted earlier, calls it the soul nerve because it's so essential to who we are as humans. And it runs from sort of the middle of your head behind your soft palate, through your body, through your organs and core, and terminates in your pelvis. And that's the path of travel for the stress response. And so that's why, when you feel nervous or you start to feel angry, you may feel butterflies or a sensation in your stomach, or you may feel your neck tighten. For me, it's often my jaw. I'll sometimes clench my jaw, and it's part of that stress response, my body bearing down against whatever's coming. And so some vagus nerve exercises, again, you can Google this and you'll get plenty of them. Some vagus nerve exercises that can help turn down that reactivity, just consciously soften your jaw. Just let your lower jaw hang a bit. And that's part of sending the message to your brain, I'm safe in this moment. I don't need to bear down, in order to brace for a fight. taking the deep breaths, the expansion of stomach and lungs sends that same safe message to slow down. Often when your stress response gets activated, if you're kicked over into that fight or flight mode, it will narrow your vision, because think of how helpful that would be if you're in a survival situation, to be able to focus on the danger that's coming towards you. But unless your life is actively being threatened, that may not be a helpful response in the moment. But it's a part of our normal neurological response to stress. And so just softening your gaze, seeing what you can see in your peripheral vision, widening, your view, can help turn down, again, the temperature of the stress response, help complete that cycle. So it gets fired, but then it can turn down, and that keeps it from getting stuck. And you may have to do that repeatedly, managing reactivity and really all of these things and completing the stress cycle. It may take a day, it may take an hour, it may take months to complete, depending on, how you are and who you are and the kind of stress or trauma that you have experienced. And so in the long run, learning to recognize and take some measures to respond can help complete the cycle, but it doesn't mean it's going to stay complete forever. You may have to revisit it and revisit it and revisit it. And so that's why it's good to also build around you a system of support.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that as well, Jay, spiritual practices can be incredibly helpful in both body-based strategies and managing reactivity, those intentional practices that you're putting into place, whether it be meditation or the way that you observe Sabbath or anything at all. I know in ministry, Sabbath looks different. Sometimes you're having your Sabbath on a Monday or a Thursday, but being able to build in those spiritual practices also tends to that aspect of a person, along with the body and the mind as well. And to your point about engaging support systems, what we would really want to emphasize is that nobody is alone in the fact that they experience stress. And so I would invite you to take a minute to think about a time when you heard someone say something or express something, and internally you sort of said to yourself, oh, me too. And the relief that came with that, or whatever emotion that came with that, maybe it was grief, maybe it was anger, maybe it was something else. But that idea that by hearing from another person, seeing another person's experience, hearing about it, that allowed your own stress response potentially to complete, or it allowed you to realize that you're not alone in what you were thinking and what you were experiencing. And that is a really powerful part of healing, not just completing the stress cycle, but also healing from experiences that you may have had. And so when we think about engaging support systems, we're thinking about accessing, co-regulating with intentionality. We're talking about what can we do to get support, whether it's professionally through trauma-informed therapy, which I'm going to plug here because I am a therapist, or in a moment when Jay talks about support from friends and colleagues. So when it comes to therapy, some people come to the conversation about therapy with a little bit of baggage and potentially from your own cultural, religious, or just personal experiences or beliefs about therapy and about the psychological realm. You might find that the idea of accessing trauma-informed therapy to be something that you really struggle with. And so I want to encourage you to just understand that trauma-informed therapy is here as a way and as a means of helping you understand yourself more so that you can safely complete the stress cycle and so that you can process and integrate the experiences that you've had, whether simply stress and burnout based or whether traumatic experience based, so that you can move forward in your process, understanding, offering your self-compassion more, but so that you can build upon that healing in a way that is helpful and compassionate, not just for you, but for the people around you. And so trauma-informed therapy is one of the ways that can happen. And there can be challenges and barriers of access to services for a variety of reasons. but primarily want to encourage you to consider that trauma-informed therapy can be a very helpful tool and helpful place for you to process some of these experiences that you have in a ministry setting. And also there can be oftentimes trauma-informed therapists who also can integrate faith and spirituality into their practice so that you can process the totality of your experiences in that setting as well. Jay?
Yeah, and my plug for trauma-informed therapy too is that modern trauma-informed therapy has some really great tools and practices for connecting mind and body, and to do some physical things as a part of the therapy that really help complete the stress cycle as well, or to reintegrate the experience of it too. It can be helpful as well to get support from colleagues and friends. I think we know this intuitively because, oftentimes we will turn to friends or colleagues to talk about the trials and the struggles of ministry or hard experiences that we've had. This can be a challenge for clergy because often, our community of people that we can trust with struggle is a bit smaller. It's really difficult to be as open with church members, for example, as we would be with, a close friend or another colleague. And so enlisting the support of friends probably needs to be more intentional for clergy in order to be really fully effective. And so when we say get support from friends or colleagues, we don't mean dump on them and just vent all of the stress and the trial and the hard thing. I mean, now that can be helpful at times, to kind of just rage and express the anger that you're feeling, or, kind of get the fight-flight response out. But oftentimes friends or colleagues don't quite know what to do with that. And so it can be better to do sort of a low-impact debriefing, because if we tell our stories with the same kinds of energy that we experienced them, that can sort of reset that stress cycle and put us back into the place of elevated stress and in the middle of the stress response, rather than moving back toward the middle of the window of tolerance. And so if we engage sort of a low-impact debriefing where we covenant with a colleague or a friend and say, look, I've had this stressful experience, or I'm feeling stress in this way, and I really need just to tell somebody about it so that I can, move through all of the stress cycle. And to be able to do that in a safe space, a safe setting, and their sort of part of the covenant would be to remain unanxious with you, to help co-regulate, to help bring your nervous system kind of back into that calmness. So they need to be prepared and capable of doing that. And then to just be the good active listeners like we learned in pastoral care, where they're not telling their own stories or not interrupting just for information, but acknowledging what they hear and acknowledging the struggle or the pain. And so it's a bit more of an intentional process than just sort of dumping on a friend when you're in the moment. Additionally, our hope is that clergy have access to peer groups, or you have denominational resources that you can call on, trusted people who understand both the work of ministry and how, stress, experiences of burnout or compassion fatigue, or even some of the trauma of ministry that impacts us. Some folks who are around us who have that understanding, who then can, be the trusted folks to serve in that sort of debriefing role.
And being aware that if you are the hearer, how that hearing and receiving those stories, how that impacts your own regulated state. And so it's not even just about how can we go and debrief with others and what feels safe and connected to us, but for the partners in those settings or the people in those support groups or those settings, also being aware of what is the impact on me when I am the person to whom all of the clergy in my denomination come to for help because they took this course and now they know all about it, right? And so when we think about that, it's also important that it's not just about us telling someone, but when we receive those stories, how does that impact? And being aware of those somatic elicitations, what does that cause to arise in us that reminds us of our own burnout, our own compassion fatigue, our own traumatic stress as well? And so interacting with those things with intentionality, thinking about engaging support systems with intentionality rather than reactivity, so that we can have curiosity and compassion not only for ourselves but for those around us who are in need of that support. The brain is always looking for safety. Our nervous systems are always seeking for safety. And so having intentional conversations about where we can access that is so important for us to feel safe, calm, and present.
So we introduced a concept, a word, a phrase at the beginning that we haven't talked about yet, compassion satisfaction. And so it's our hope that in recognizing the stress cycle, in understanding how experiences of ministry, set us up potentially to experience burnout or compassion fatigue or our own traumatic experiences in ministry, and then learning some practices and some ways to complete the stress cycle, to return to that middle of the window of tolerance where we're feeling calm and engaged and able to function at a really high, healthy level, that would cultivate in clergy a sense of compassion satisfaction, which is, that deep engagement, that fulfillment that comes from living out your calling in its fullness. Practicing great stewardship of yourself as you serve a congregation well. Compassion satisfaction, we hope, is something that you encounter even when you recognize stress, because being able to see how it can have a cycle and a life then gives you hope that because it's hard now, it won't be hard forever. And so if you would like to be a part of a community that talks about these things from time to time, send me an email. We'll gather online and continue to talk about what it means to engage burnout or compassion fatigue or to experience trauma in ministry, and how a trauma-informed response can lead us to greater compassion satisfaction. So finally now, take another moment to take a breath, to think about the things that you've heard over these 3 sessions, about how you're built to experience stress to move you toward safety, how ministry itself can activate our stress response, but we have practices and ability to move us through that stress cycle and back into calm and engaged presence with others in our family, in our lives, in our congregations. There are questions for reflection in your study guide. And one more time, take a moment to feel what your body is telling you about what you've heard today. Are you resisting in some ways? Do you feel tension? Or do you feel relax and release? Listen to your body with compassion and with curiosity.